Right, let's get going, as you've all been kind enough to brave the weather and get here on time. And obviously there'll be others coming in. There are copies of the Global Risk Report, if you haven't picked one up, at the door. So if you haven't and you want to browse through it as we're talking, we're going to run for an hour. My name's Nick Gowing with BBC World. And the aim over the next hour is really to illuminate this complex matrix up there. It's not as formidable as it looks. We're going to build it for you with the four areas: economic risk, geopolitical risk, societal risk, and environmental risk, with our experts here. This, just to remind you, is a product of a series of brainstorming sessions and seminars which have taken place. So it's a pull together. It's not just something which is ephemeral, which has just come to the mind of those who wrote the report. As a partial outsider, but someone responsible for reporting the outcome and the impact of risks which have been badly assessed and things that go wrong around the world, one of the things that really strikes me from the executive summary is the fact that there's a myopic tendency, or worse, which prevails among many in business. I have to say, probably in our business as well, in the broadcast business and the media business. But the failure to address what could be, and rather than relying simply on your assessment of the last risk, which threatened or created impact on your corporation or whatever organization you work for. I want to move this quite sprightly. There's a lot to get through in an hour. And I'd like to begin by asking Kevin Watts from Merrill Lynch International, the chairman, just to give an idea of why he feels this is so important. Then we're going to start building that matrix over the next 35, 40 minutes. You will be able to come in as well. I'm not going to be ruthless about this. I'll encourage you to come in. But I want to have built that matrix in about the next 40 minutes. Kevin.
Thank you, Nick. Our business is all about risk, financial risk, and financial risk is the manifestation of many other forms of risk. Risk isn't bad, in fact. We tend to, particularly at meetings like Davos, view risk in a negative way. Risk is actually the basis for return in our industry. But as we manage our own risk more and more precisely, and we think more and more effectively, we're ever aware of the complexity of risk and the unexpected risks that face us. So when Thierry Malloret at the WEF came to us and suggested this is a project for us to collaborate, I was delighted because it was central to our preoccupations, and we felt the preoccupations of many people. We felt we could contribute significantly to the analysis and help Thierry and team, and the team with Thierry have done a marvelous job on this project. I was also particularly pleased with the concept of workshops and an ongoing discussion that would be presented here, further discussed here, and extended into the future. So you really need dialogue over time to deal with this complexity.
Just, Kevin, can I just check with you? Do you subscribe to the very clear summary here, which is there's a widespread tendency among many businesses to be well prepared only for the last event that has occurred, and a failure to realize that not assessing global risks and thinking often of the worst case scenario is having a dramatic impact on many corporations when they fail to meet their earnings expectations?
I think more and more companies are aware of the danger of managing the last risk, but I think we have some way to go in order to predict the unexpected risks. I think most companies are good at managing the risks that are very central to their business model. But as this work shows, the unexpected risk in left field can affect your business model very, very quickly now.
All right, well, let's move forward on the risks. That's how we're going to start building it. You do have it, and those of you who've just arrived, there is a hard copy if you haven't picked it up if you want to. Gareth Evans, President of the International Crisis Group, I'd like you to talk to the first issue of geopolitical risk, and then Ron Noble, and thanks for arriving. We understand the problems. Ron, I'd like you to just respond to Gareth afterwards.
Well, let me begin by trying to reduce the 12 blobs there to 4 in terms of the really big things we need to worry about geopolitically so far as their impact on the global economy is concerned. The first one is clearly terrorism, not just terrorism at large, but terrorist attack directed at a major Western target. And we have to say that The big one, even though it hasn't yet happened, the combination of a terrorist assault with a nuclear device or biological weapon of some readily foreseeable kind. Although that hasn't happened in the last 3 and a bit years since 9/11, there's absolutely no basis on which one can confidently assert that it won't happen. The probability is indeed high, and of course the impact of that happening in any kind of major city will be extreme. The problems we've got are obviously that Iraq has proved to be quite disastrously counterproductive in terms of its impact on the Arab Islamic terrorist phenomenon. The general reality is that Islamic world grievances are not still being adequately addressed, although we've got our fingers crossed for Israel-Palestine this year in particular. Terrorist networks are growing. There are inadequate controls worldwide on the availability of nuclear weapons and fissile material, and generally the basic military, police, intelligence triad way of approaching the whole terrorist phenomenon is insufficient to do the job. So that's real, that's big. Second risk that I'd identify is what I call meltdown in the Gulf. It's really a combination of the Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, with a little bit of Israel, Palestine thrown in together. And I think it's the interaction of these various events that what we need to worry about most, although any one of them, to the extent that they involve major disruptions of the oil market, are obviously going to be very significant. But in short, Iraq could get even worse than it is at the moment, dividing and destabilising the whole region. Iran could go nuclear, Saudi Arabia could follow, Israel could launch a preemptive strike. Nuclear miscalculations are always possible. Very few of the new players on the nuclear scene seem to be very good at applying Cold War command and control disciplines. The prospect is high of a major terrorist strike against oil production facilities, for example in Saudi itself. And the problem of any disruption of the oil supply in the Middle East is of course that much worse, to the extent that simultaneously other oil producing or transporting areas happen to implode, and that can't be excluded, that possibility, in Russia or Central Asia or various crucial parts of Africa or Venezuela. So that's all pretty ugly, and it's the impact, of course, of all that happening, or a significant part of it, would be extreme. The credibility of it happening is reasonable. It's credible. It's not likely, but it's certainly credible. Meltdown in Northeast Asia would be my third way of combining the blobs there, the China-Taiwan blob and the North Korea blob. The China-Taiwan cross-strait relationship is still dangerously fragile. It's not so much a matter of either side wanting to go to war. Each of them realise how disastrous that would be. But you have to say that such is the existential character of the issues involved between them that miscalculations are always possible. And it will be hard for the US to avoid involvement if that happens, with everything that will flow from that. North Korean nuclear weapons acquisition is now pretty much a given as a result of the failure of negotiations to make any progress over the last couple of years. That could easily trigger a major arms race as the impact of that begins to sink in. The China-Japan relationship is not in good shape at the moment, and history does also continue to haunt some other relationships in that region, as China-South Korea, and to some extent, although less now, Japan-South Korea relationships. China's still going to have to work hard to avoid internal disruptions, although confidence that that can be avoided is reasonably high at the moment. The final risk that I'd identify is right down in the sort of bottom corner there, left-hand corner, not very high on the chart, and that's the risks associated with failed, failing and fragile states. The problem is that there's some 70 or 80 states around the world that basically, frankly, lack the normal characteristics of sovereignty as we've traditionally assumed them, a capacity to maintain order and deliver basic governance. And that does have huge implications, as we're beginning to appreciate, for harbouring and nurturing terrorism, certainly for international crime, as Ron Noble will no doubt want to say, especially drugs and human trafficking. Also got implications for generating health pandemics, for refugee outflows, and indeed significant environmental problems elsewhere, although terrorism is probably the single most important element. You have to say that the impact of this is not a sort of single sharp impact in the same way as the other risk areas I've identified. It's more diffuse and feeds into other things, but nonetheless the impact we're talking about, this phenomenon, of that phenomenon is significant. And the probability, well, it's actual, the reality of failing states, but the probability of it not being very well addressed, this problem, in the years ahead is pretty high. So I think that's an important way of looking at that particular problem, not pushing it off to the outer margins of things to worry about. It really needs to be higher on the agenda, and that, of course, feeds into Jeffrey Sachs's Millennium Development Goals enterprise this year, and that part of the global agenda.
Thanks, Gareth. That was worth getting up early for, to listen to and to reassure us of the way things now look. Ron, can I ask you now to give an assessment, particularly on the issue of probability, how anyone calculates these kind of levels of impact and probability? I'm asking you that particularly because the outgoing Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London revealed last week that at least 8 major terrorist operations have been thwarted, in his words, in Britain in the last year. Ron.
I would have preferred to give the presentation and ask Gareth to give the probability analysis, but I'll give it my best shot. From Interpol's perspective, we know that the market for terrorists out there is wide and ever growing. And we know that around the world you can point to terrorist attack after terrorist attack on a small scale has been magnified because of the media attention and concern worldwide about terrorist attacks. The UK having thwarted 8 terrorist attacks in the UK doesn't surprise me. You can ask the US and they would probably tell you they have a number close to that, if not higher than that. From Interpol's perspective, what we see as the probability concern is that, as Gareth was saying, we know that terrorists are planning a big terrorist attack. And when I say a big terrorist attack, I don't mean from the world perspective in terms of consumption, because any terrorist attack is magnified by the media. But we know in the area of nuclear proliferation, there's a concern there of Al-Qaeda or other groups getting hold of those materials. We know in the bioterrorism area, they're planning something, they would like to do something. And Interpol says, what can we as a world community do to try to prevent this? From Interpol's perspective, we see the great flaw or the great void or the great weakness that needs to be addressed is the failing states problem that Gareth pointed to, because they are areas where terrorists can train, prepare, plan, and seek refuge, coupled with the inability of many countries to control their borders the way that their borders need to be controlled. And I don't just mean Pakistan or Afghanistan. I mean European Union countries, the US, etc. We know that from our own statistics at Interpol that there are approximately 20 million stolen passports in circulation worldwide now. 20 million. We know that as recent as 2.5 years ago, our database only had a few hundred of those stolen passport numbers. We now have 5.8 million, but that still leaves almost 14 million passports that have been stolen or lost in circulation. So we know that if you look at previous terrorist attacks, for the most part, the serious terrorist attacks, most of the participants were unknown to police. Some were, but most were unknown to police. Many of those people had either stolen passports or had made false visa applications. So from a probability perspective, we know that something will happen. We don't know where it will happen, and we don't know when it will happen. And that's the most that I can say.
And a quick word at this point, Ron, so we can just move on to the other 3 parts of the matrix. What advice would you have for the corporate world on this, given, and I quoted just before you came in from the executive summary, paragraph 5, the myopia, or worse, denial that prevails about the inevitability of such risks. I'm conscious that MI5, for example, in Britain, on their website, the head of MI5 has made it clear publicly, not with pictures, just how big the risk is for corporations and how they should prepare for it.
My response might seem strange coming from the head of Interpol, but my response to businesses would be to fight the laws or rules that are put in place that affect your transactional cost in an unreasonable way in terms of moving your product, hiring employees, moving person from one point to another. That is, I see following a terrorist attack, the reaction of governments and politicians to pass laws with draconian measures that increase the cost of doing business. But when you look at the benefits aren't there. So I think businesses should fight for common sense rules being put in place, and if the rules don't make sense, the businesses should make sure that their elected officials do something to change those rules. That might seem like a strange response, but I see the government's reaction to the terrorist attacks sometimes to not have a great connection between the reaction and the likely benefit to be produced.
All right.
Beyond that, just one other point I would make is the common sense good business practices that are employed before you hire any employee or before you move into any new area. Any common sense risk analysis in terms of employees to be hired or places to do your business, I think would serve you well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Let's now move on to the second part of the matrix, the economic risk. Fred.
Over the next year or two, and possibly much sooner, I think there are two very major risks to the world economy. One would be a renewed sharp increase in oil prices, perhaps to as much as $70 or $80 per barrel, even without a disastrous supply interruption in the Gulf of the type that Gareth Evans mentioned. The reasons are the continued very rapid rise in world demand, with world growth very rapid, and new entrants with highly inefficient use of energy, like China and India, adding greatly to the world demand side, along with very big bottlenecks on the supply of both crude petroleum and product, particularly in the United States, due in part to a very sharp reduction in investment and inadequate investment in new output over the last few years. The second big risk is a large and rapid fall of the exchange rate of the dollar, taking the euro well above 150, the yen well below 100, with consequent changes in other interest rates around the world. This, of course, is driven by the huge and rapidly rising U.S. current account deficit, which has now hit 7% of our GDP, rose by over $100 billion last year, looks like rising again at that pace now. As a result, the U.S. has to import about $5 billion of foreign capital every working day to finance both our current account deficit and our own foreign investments. If there's any diminution in that amount of inflow, let alone a withdrawal of funds from the dollar, there will be a potentially sharp decline in the exchange rate, reinforcing what's happening on the oil price side. Now, the combination of those two risks, much higher oil prices, a much lower dollar, would of course produce a very rapid pickup of inflation and a very sharp upward spike in U.S. interest rates. The Fed is already planning to double the level of U.S. short rates from 2 to 4. That would take the 10-year bond up from 4 to 6. But if, in addition, these risks that I suggest were to eventuate, those interest rates could go much higher, easily another 100, 200 basis points. And if the dollar decline was very sharp, our models show that U.S. interest rates could even go into double digits. Obviously, a huge shock to the world economy if that were to happen. The third effect, often forgotten, is that the countries whose currencies are rising as the dollar falls will experience sharp declines in their trade surpluses, requiring them to find offsetting expansions in domestic demand to keep their growth and world growth from plummeting. That means the European Central Bank will have to reduce interest rates sharply. Countries that can do it, even with a stability pact out there to constrain them, may have to expand fiscal policy as well. So there are three big consequences from these two major risks that could be very severe for the world economy. Note that the two risks intersect and reinforce each other. A sharp fall in energy prices adds, a sharp rise in energy prices adds to the growth in the U.S. trade deficit, likelihood of a big fall in the dollar. Likewise, a big fall in the dollar adds to the likelihood that the oil producers will raise their prices to offset their loss of income in real terms, and so you get an interactive spiral as the two do mutually reinforce. It was exactly that set of events, much higher oil prices, sharp falls in the dollar, that produced the term stagflation in the 1970s. And it was the very acute change in both variables in the late 1970s that brought the worst economic experience we've had since the Second World War. That was when U.S. inflation went to double digits, interest rates went to 20%. We had the worst recession since the 1930s. I don't think the outlook is nearly that bad. Monetary policy is much better now. Underlying U.S. productivity growth is very strong. But that is the direction in which those two interacting risks could push the world economy. We therefore need some important policy changes quickly, an indication by the big oil importing countries, led by the United States, that they're ready to sell from their strategic petroleum reserves to hold oil prices down. That's about the only response that's feasible in the short run. But most critically, of course, in terms of the international imbalances, a serious, credible effort by the U.S. to bring its budget deficit down so it does not require so much foreign financing, a much better balanced adjustment of international interest rates, with China stopping the sharp decline of its currency that goes along with its peg to the dollar, bringing Asia into the adjustment process, taking some of the pressure off Europe, Canada, and the floating rate countries, and expansion of domestic demand, as I mentioned, by the surplus countries who are going to experience much further increases in their currencies and big declines in their external positions.
Thanks, Fred. Stack up your questions and points. I'd just like to get to the end of the matrix. Let's now move on to the third part, the green elements up there, the environmental risks. And John, would you like to speak to that? And just remember as well what Tony Blair said as the chair of the G8 yesterday about the commitment on the G8 on climate change and global warming. Will that make any difference to your assessment?
Thank you. If you've looked at the report, you'll see that there is a variety of environmental risks under discussion. But the point that I would like to emphasize is that global climate change is almost certain to prove to be both the most dangerous and the most intractable of the environmental problems that the world faces. It's the most dangerous because the climate is the envelope within which all other environmental conditions and processes that are important to human well-being have to function. If you distort the climatic envelope enough, you put at risk the stable operation of all of the rest of those environmental conditions and processes, which means you're putting at risk the productivity of agriculture, of forestry, of fisheries. You're putting at risk and altering the geography of pests and pathogens, from termites to malaria. You're increasing the damages that have to be expected from storms, from floods, from droughts, from heat waves, from wildfires. You're increasing the risks to coastal settlements from the rise in sea level, and I should say also the risk to coastal infrastructure from the rise in sea level that is already underway, and a good deal more. The problem of global climate change is the most intractable of the major environmental problems we face because the principal cause is the combustion of fossil fuels, which is responsible for something approaching 80% of the world's primary energy supply. And of course, I don't need to explain to anybody in this room that energy is the lifeblood of our economies. It is an indispensable ingredient of material prosperity. It is essential to fuel economic growth. And so we have this tremendous tension between the essential economic role of energy and its dominant role in driving the principal and most dangerous economic problem of our time. This is not stratospheric ozone and chlorofluorocarbons, where a small number of products manufactured by a small number of companies and used for a limited variety of purposes and with readily available substitutes could be altered quickly in order to start addressing the problem. This is a situation in which the global energy infrastructure, 80% fossil fuels, represents a capital investment of roughly $12 trillion. That's what you'd have to pay if you wanted to replace the drilling rigs, the refineries, the power plants, the transmission lines, the whole works for the planet. $12 trillion turns over about every 40 years. If you don't like the energy system we now have, if you decide that because of its impacts on global climate, which you determine are becoming intolerable, you need to change it. You cannot change that system overnight. If you want the energy system in 2050 to look very different than the energy system looks today, you better start changing it now. The second thing I would say about the climate change issue is that the science has been changing quite rapidly, and unfortunately it's been changing in a direction that underlines the magnitude of the problem and the pace at which it is advancing upon us. Even since the 2001 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was very explicit about climate change being a reality, about human activities being a significant part of it, additional evidence has come in, published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, that says things are changing more rapidly than had been understood even in 2001. The Greenland ice sheet is melting much more rapidly than had been understood in 2001. The total amount of ice in the Greenland ice sheet, if it all melted, is enough to raise sea level 6 to 7 meters. It would probably take 350 years for that process of melting to be complete. But 7 meters in 350 years is 1 meter every 50 years, 2 meters in a century. The 2001 best estimate of sea level rise in the 21st century was half a meter. If it turns out that the currently more pessimistic estimates of what's happening in Greenland are correct, you could have 2.5 meters in this century. The West Antarctic ice sheet, which it has been known for a long time, is susceptible to destabilization in a warming world, slumping into the ocean and raising sea level another 7 meters. This was thought to be a highly improbable event in 2001. A variety of peer-reviewed scientific publications based on measurements in Antarctica since 2001 suggest that this is more likely than had previously been supposed. That's another 7 meters in 350 or 400 years. Again, it might not be right. Those assessments might be too pessimistic. But it is possible that we are looking at multiple meters of sea level rise in this century. And that puts at risk not only the kinds of settlements and villages close to sea level that were destroyed in the tsunami. It puts at risk New York City, London, Washington, D.C., Boston, a wide variety of the world's most important and most expensive cities. Business, risk, and opportunity. For business, clearly there is both risk and opportunity in this picture. The risks are of two kinds: damages to assets and earnings, and liability of management for actions taken or not taken to protect the interests of their shareholders and to protect society in the face of this range of risks. In terms of opportunity, as the message of the evolving science becomes more widely understood, it is going to produce a sharp increase in the interest of societies all around the world in advanced energy technologies that can deliver the energy goods and services that people want in energy-saving and environment-sparing ways. More efficient energy end use, more efficient automobiles, industrial processes, light bulbs, refrigerators, buildings, renewable energy sources, advanced fossil fuel technologies that can derive the energy from fossil fuel but capture the carbon and keep it out of the atmosphere. There will be a revisiting of the nuclear energy option to see if the liabilities that have prevented its wider expansion until now can be addressed. There will be business opportunities in adaptation to the degree of climate change that cannot be avoided. I'll stop there.
And after what Tony Blair said yesterday, quick remark?
Well, I thought Tony Blair gave a good speech on climate change. Those of us who are worried about this problem are, I think, reassured by his restated commitment to pursue climate change as one of the major priorities of the British presidency.
And do you think he can mobilize the developed world on this quickly?
I hope so, but it remains unclear. And perhaps most unclear is whether he can mobilize George W. Bush.
So you're cautious. All right, let's move on finally to the last of the four areas, societal risks. Sam.
Well, we now have a very colorful chart that looks like almost every block is full. And I think the distinctive point I'd want to begin with is if you notice the difference when the societal risks went up, they're all likely or certain. They're all at the top of the chart. You'll also notice when you look at those lists and the identification of those lists that they are a bit different. When you think of the geopolitical risk, the economic risk, and even in some degrees the environmental risk we've just talked about. The risk from the societal side are risks that we all relate to. They're easy for us to understand, and in fact, in many cases, they're very personal, that we can see their impacts. They are macro in nature, much like the other risks we've talked about, and they do bring complexity in their own right. We each have our biases about them and our own perspectives, but the fact that they're all likely and certain brings a different set of urgencies to them. I don't think we've really appreciated the interconnectedness of these risks, and especially when you combine the certainty and the likelihood of these societal risks with all of those red risks that Gareth talked about, then I think you can see some of the challenges we have. Some of the ones that maybe didn't make the top end of the list of the groups that we talked about are really very obvious to us. Poverty, clearly a certainty. Maybe the fact that the impact is small is simply because we've begun to accept it. Aging demographics, and when you combine the aging demographics with some of the economic issues that Fred talked about, you can see some of the serious things that we might face, but a few that we'd like to highlight. Infectious diseases, and again, something that I think everyone in the room can relate to very directly. Probability, certain or likely, impact extreme, and frankly, given all the things that we've talked about around the movement of people and trade and the fact that the climate change and other things that John referenced, the resistance to drugs that are going on today throughout all of our societies, and we can see the examples, SARS, HIV, AIDS, but actually we can see infectious diseases that are old but becoming very new in their impact, like TB and cholera. The outbreak of a mutated flu that could kill millions. And the fact that the health regimes around the world are simply not prepared for it. And what would happen if these diseases spread quickly, the impacts on economies, and the impacts on the stability of the governments that were talked about earlier. The second that I'll go a bit more in depth, and that's the unrestrained migration of people. And these failing states, the instability of lots of the parts of the world that we're dealing with. We're not talking about migration of people being bad in its own right. We're really talking about migration of people that's uncontrolled, that's caused by war, that's caused by terrorism. I mean, one of the panels yesterday talked about a major terrorist effect inside urban environments. What would happen to the migration of people out of cities around the world? What are the economic impacts of an event such as that? Often driven by external factors, but the instability in labor, the instability in the economic impact is clearly severe as you look at the effects. And I think the third, and probably the one that I could say the least about, but we all understand, is the rise of radical Islam. And again, probability certain, impact major, right at the top. And this is really a balance between the discussions where people dialogue about the war on terror and, frankly, the Western world coming to grips with the impact of the spread of radical Islam. What does it mean? It's not a Middle East, U.S. issue. It's a world issue. And how do you adapt policy, and how do we adapt and adjust to the threats that are brought about by that? The societal changes are very personal. Everyone in the room can relate to them.
Quick question, Sam. Do you see the populations or some people in places like New York, Boston, Washington, London reacting to that kind of information that John's given about the rise of sea level and saying, we've got to get out of here, sell our real estate, and move up to somewhere higher? Is that a societal risk?
It clearly has an impact, and I think that John's probable frustration is the fact that it's there, it's fairly scientifically certain, but it's a 350-year event, and people are saying, well, I'll do that next year. And so we do not see, from a business perspective, people backing away from coast by a half a kilometer because they're afraid the sea level is going to rise by a meter. We don't see that.
All right. Right. John, What about when you calculate probabilities and you hear all of this, what do you say?
Well, you know, I probably wouldn't get up in the morning if I was purely obsessed with these things. I feel a little bit more positive about business. May sound rather foolish.
But can you calculate these probabilities in the way that we've put them on the chart?
No one knows the probabilities of all these events. We make estimates, and then we try and validate our estimates over time. We as a company would report our top 15 risk scenarios to our board of directors every year. And we would analyze those risk scenarios, and we would put some economic consequences alongside of them. Wouldn't be quite the same. I'm in the insurance business. We're good at talking about plague, pestilence, and nasty surprises. But we would have a kind of different list. We wouldn't be so focused on the geopolitical. You know, what are the business consequences? What can we do about it? Are questions we would have to ask before we said this is a high priority for us. But if I look at the geopolitical, I would say 10 years ago it was more scary when you were worried about great superpowers tossing weapons of mass destruction at each other, rather than today they're trading partners. So maybe there's some progress in the world. And we would also worry about missing opportunities in new trading environments, Russia, Turkey, big potentials for the future. The Middle East is, 1.5% of world GDP. It's the collateral issues from the Middle East which are more relevant than the economies themselves. So from a Coomber perspective, we would have a chief risk officer. We would have process for analyzing risk. Chief risk officer would make evaluation of risk. He would separate between what we call future risks, emerging risks. We have what we call a sonar team. And there we would look at things like climate change. We would look at new technologies like nanotechnology. And nanotechnology may be a trillion-dollar product in 10 years' time. So that's opportunity and risk go side by side. Then we would look at current risks, and we'd form evaluations of how relevant they are for us, identify the risk, evaluate the risk. What's the mitigation? What can we do to mitigate risk? You can diversify risk, that's the obvious form of mitigation. But you can control risk, and we talk about recession. If you really anticipate recession, you should look at your leverage ratios, you should look at the relationship between your fixed costs and your variable costs, and you should try and manage these things. So I think business, where it's failing at the moment to really, where the ones who don't survive fail, is not enough emphasis on contingency planning and not enough emphasis on post-event strategy. But I do think that the big businesses give a lot of consideration to risk and also issues not on the chart like reputational risk, operational risk, which will affect revenues and results.
Just before I go to Kevin, bullet 3 in the executive summary, those 10 leading risks, John, if you've got it there: instability in Iraq, terrorism, emerging fiscal crises, disruption in oil supplies, radical Islam, sudden decline in China's growth, pandemics, climate change, WMD, and unrestrained migration and related tensions. Are there new elements there which you think that your business is going to have to reflect and realign towards?
Some of those are in our list. Pandemic is in our list. Terrorism, weapons of mass destruction will be in our list. And these we report also to our investors, by the way. We consider the others. We have a political unit that looks at risk and opportunity globally, but they don't necessarily impact our business perspective.
Kevin.
Perhaps I can pick up on a note of optimism, John's point about contingency planning, which I do agree with based on our own experience. My company actually was very significantly affected by 9/11. Our headquarters is across the street from the World Trade Center, and I was there outside at the time and saw it happen and then helped put our business back together again. We learned then, the management team at Merrill Lynch then, learned that the business continuity plan that we had was not a theoretical exercise. And we implemented it, and since then we've learned a lot of lessons from that experience. So dealing with risk, catastrophic risks that affect your business is something that I think the major corporations of the world think a lot about, worry a lot about, and develop contingency plans about. So that's the optimism. On the other hand, picking up a comment that Sam made. The time horizon for many of these risks is way beyond the quarterly earnings statement and the likely tenure of the CEO of a major multinational company today, which I think is something like 18 months or something. That is a real issue around corporate decision-making. And the other point, picking up John again, corporate management looking at some of these issues say, well, what can we do about that? And so there are two major constraints in terms of businesses' readiness to engage on these issues, i.e., does it affect our business today? Is it going to affect the CEO's tenure? And is it something we can do anything about? And unless there are affirmative answers to those questions, the issue does not move up the corporate agenda.
Is there any CEO out there who's been in his position a long time and has embraced all these risks and produced good earnings and quarterly statements and feels comfortable putting these into the corporate plan? They're obviously having breakfast meetings at the moment elsewhere. Sam, do you want to add anything else to what we've heard from John and Kevin?
Yeah, I think John's point that that the business world in the last really 5-10 years, but particularly in this since the years 2000, 2001, have become very sophisticated at assessing risks that impact them directly, and are becoming more sophisticated in looking at these risks that are at the fringes. I think the key that, and your point, Nick, that's really important, now going to the next generation, the next level, of the interconnectedness of these risks, and how one risk could play off another. We see our clients clearly understanding now the fiscal crises issues, even though they're macro, that we're not going to change the policy of the U.S. government out of one company, but collectively we can begin to make those happen. And we see these interconnectedness. So I actually am very encouraged by the way business looks at these risks. When you throw them all on one chart, it's a bit overwhelming, but I actually feel that business understands the China risk, the fiscal risk, they understand the climate risk, they're dealing with many of these issues in a way that they are hopeful to be able to manage.
Please do, yes.
We talk about the China risk now because China has become a major trading partner. Not so long ago, we had a different perspective on China risk. I mean, for most of us, the real issue of China is it's a huge opportunity. We're spending resources to capture that opportunity. And the risk that it might not happen is what we're now talking about. It's a big change from where we were a few years ago. Now, as a CEO with 2 years tenure, first of all, we're getting worried. Secondly, it's not only the CEO, the board of directors really should be pushing this question of what risks lie inside the firm. And I think that's happening more and more because directors realize their responsibilities. And you should see specific committees on the board set up for this purpose.
All right, let me try the next 15 minutes of anyone who wants to contribute from the floor with this issue of how we get over the myopia. 2 mics, can you raise your hands if you want to intervene, please? And there's also one other point, one here and one here, please. Microphone here. There's also one other point, which is point 2 in the layout for this session. What risks might create a perfect storm when combined? If anyone has any contribution of the dreadful doomsday scenario, please.
Yes, Dan Spiegel from Washington. I'd like to challenge the view that business has taken on board, at least in the United States, the climate risk, because I don't see how the Bush administration could be so resistant to the whole climate change issue if the business community was really engaged on the dangers posed by climate change, because the Bush administration, quite frankly, takes its lead from the American business community.
All right, quick pick up, John. Do you want to pick up?
Very quickly, I think that situation has been changing quite rapidly in the United States. Last month, a foundation-funded bipartisan National Commission on Energy Policy released its report recommending, among other things, a mandatory cap-and-trade system for carbon emissions. That report was signed by John Rowe, the CEO of Exelon, one of the biggest electric utilities in the United States, signed by Archie Dunham, who had just stepped down as CEO of ConocoPhillips, signed by a good many other senior figures in American business, as well as by a labor leader, a consumer leader, and so on and so forth. I think there is an emerging consensus in the U.S. society, which the Bush White House hasn't quite caught up with yet, but it is happening. Business is only going to get out in front so far because business needs a level playing field. It needs a framework within which not just one progressive business, but its competitors also need to live. And so there does have to be, as Tony Blair so eloquently said last night, an interaction between the governmental framework and business as both move forward. But I think my perception about the changing climate, if you'll forgive the term, in American business in relation to this problem is that it's changing even more rapidly than the physical climate is changing. And ultimately, I expect this will have to bring the Bush administration around.
I want to be quite sprightly about this. Does anyone else want to pick up any points about the third area, environmental risk? Let's try and keep these together. An environment, please.
Tom DeQuino from Canada. A lot of the risks that we've been talking about are uncertain. There is one risk around which there's a great deal of certainty, and that is that most scientists will agree, whatever the dispute or the debate is on the science, that the world will get warmer. What concerns me, having followed the global climate change debate, is an enormous amount of energy and time has been spent on how we cut down CO2 emissions, very little on the mitigation aspect. And if I were looking at all the elements of our discussions here today, I raised the question with Mr. Holdren. Why is it that so little time, so little technology, so little effort has been spent on the mitigation aspect of this, given that we know in one way or another that it's coming?
First of all, the terminology that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has advanced uses mitigation to describe the measures you take to try to avoid or reduce the climate change itself, and they use adaptation to refer to things you do to live with the amount of climate change you get. And I think your question is, why don't we look more at what the IPCC calls adaptation? And you've got a good point. The effort on that is accelerating now. There is a lot more interest in adaptation now than there was a few years ago, a lot more work starting to be done on it. The major studies of what to do about climate change that I'm aware of and involved in now have roughly equal emphasis on mitigation and adaptation. I think you'll see that in the kinds of reports that will be forthcoming over the next few years. A very important point, because we will not be able to avoid climate change altogether. The best we can do is to reduce what we're in for, and we do need to make investments and pursue research and development to figure out how best to adapt.
Do you have one more question on environment? No. Okay. Anyone else on environment quickly? Otherwise I'll move on. No. Fine, please.
Two questions regarding weapons of mass destruction and terrorist attacks. Is there not some way that you have to track the who's selling and who's buying these weapons? Do you not have some kind of profile by now? Number one. And number two, with regard to intelligence, we live in a world of a lot of gizmos up in space. There's the CIA, FBI, KGB, MI6. America has 13 intelligence agencies. Is there not some way, are you telling me that all of these agencies are failing, or is there some way in which they need to be fine-tuned in order to reduce the risks of terrorist attacks here in America and elsewhere?
I'll take another couple of questions on geopolitical, but Ron, 2020 vision.
I would say that there are select intelligence agencies or law enforcement agencies around the world that know about individual groups, individual terrorist groups that are planning or trying to purchase weapons of mass destruction. I would say it's clear they don't all share all information with one another, first point. Second point, I would say, even if they did share the information, the border controls of countries around the world are so porous or so weak that the likelihood of stopping any of those people from point A to point B is very, very slim. And third, something that not a lot of people talk a lot about is this problem of language. Many of the terrorists speak Arabic, write Arabic, read Arabic. So the time lag between intercepting a phone conversation or an email message until that information is translated and circulated is often great. So I'd say although the intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies are doing quite a bit and are making great improvements, when we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, it only takes one terrorist group to have an impact that none of us would want to have occur. And the second point I would say is, it's hard to tie this directly to Iraq, but you've got to be cognizant of it. The greatest fear law enforcement has are the terrorists who are inspired but who have not yet committed terrorist acts, who no one knows anything about except the terrorist groups that they're working for. So they could use their own names, their own passports, travel from point A to point B, and not be intercepted. From law enforcement's perspective, I see that as the greatest threat. And from my perspective, the perfect storm is that perfect terrorist who moves from point A to point B with a perfect weapon and creates an attack that none of us would want to have happen, and then that attack is followed by subsequent threats of attack.
The question is about technology. What about interagency cooperation, not just between countries, but within countries, which requires software to talk to itself, and also people to talk to each other within agencies and between agencies?
We tried an experiment at Interpol. We had heard from the law enforcement agencies around the world, and certainly the intelligence community, that you couldn't trust an organization like Interpol that had 182 member countries, including some countries that are often criticized or labeled on charge as being great risks for terrorist attacks. So we tried an experiment in September of 2002. We said, please, give us the name of the people you suspect as being terrorists. We asked all of our countries to do this. Our first meeting, we had 17 to 20 countries there to listen, not give any names. Now, in 2005, we have a list that's grown from 2,000 names of suspected terrorists to over 8,500 names of suspected terrorists. So I believe law enforcement and intelligence community are willing to share if they can get something back. What we need to do is make sure that these names, these databases are checked or are consulted, and that's where the problem of communication comes into place.
And can you share that information with business? Gareth, would you like to answer that question?
Commercial break at this point.
Well, Nick, I was just going to say that during my ministerial career I was responsible for 2 intelligence agencies, and I never got into more political trouble than when I took their advice at face value. So I'm extremely sceptical about the contribution that intelligence is capable of making. We discovered to our cost just the scale of the AQ Khan Walmart, which nobody had any idea how big it was. So in Rumsfeldian terms, there's lots of known unknowns out there and there's lots of unknown unknowns. And if we think, in short, that policing, intelligence and ultimately military approaches are going to solve the terrorism WMD problem for us, we're smoking something. I mean, the truth of the matter is it has to be a much more comprehensive strategy addressing the political grievance and everything else.
And the human element in cooperation between people within agencies and agencies themselves within a country.
Well, there's a hell of a lot more can be done in that respect, and I think there's lots more sensitivity to the need to do that, lots more delivery, but the short point is it's an imperfect solution to a problem that needs a much more multi-dimensional approach.
All right, I've got 7 or 8 minutes, but let's stay on geopolitical. Do you want to talk about geopolitical or not?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and then one at the back, yeah, please.
Philip Bowring, International Herald Tribune. I suggest that geopolitical vision that you're showing is very much a Western one, and you ask some of the same questions in East Asia, you get very different answers. For example, Islam. I would imagine that many people in the world see fundamentalist Christianity and its impact on US foreign policy as just as much a threat as Islam, radical Islam. Ditto India, the threat of Hinduism to secular polity. We look at this thing over here, and we see that Iran is seen as an extreme threat and a credible one. Is it Iran which is a threat? Is it Iran, which is surrounded by countries with nuclear weapons, a threat? Or is it the people who are threatening Iran if it should attempt to acquire nuclear weapons? Which is the danger?
All right. Anyone want to respond to that? And Joe Nye at the back about geopolitical, Joe, yep. Okay. Anyone want to respond on that? No, please, at the back.
One of the things we found in defending against terrorism, any given company that goes beyond a certain level of measures is at a competitive disadvantage, because basically there are benefits to society as a whole which the company itself doesn't gain from, and therefore these are so-called externalities. Therefore, you're faced with a puzzle. We're not doing enough on homeland security to deal with these risks. One possible solution to this is government regulation. Government regulation is often sticky, imperfect, and not effective. The other possibility is the insurance industry. The insurance industry is the part of business that has a unique capacity to level the playing field for all companies. If your insurance is going up against any of these risks, then it pays you to take the measures which otherwise would put you at a competitive disadvantage. I'd like to hear from Swiss Re, what leadership has the insurance industry taken in this regard?
Joe, when you say we, who do you mean? We found. When you say we found?
We had a study at the Kennedy
being
School.
Harvard.
We had a study at the Kennedy School, Harvard, on homeland security and responses to terrorism. What we found is that you were not getting an adequate response by businesses acting individually.
Okay, over here. But John, can you respond, please?
I'm not entirely sure what you're expecting the insurance industry to do. Companies identify risks. They set tolerance levels they set probabilities for the risk occurring and set tolerance levels for the business costs they're going to spend to mitigate the risk. Now, you can buy insurance against property, but that's not the only aspect of business risk. There are many things which are difficult to insure, so I'm probably not understanding the question properly.
Joe? Microphone back, please, yeah.
A very simple proposition is if your insurance goes up because you haven't put in measures in the buildings you're building, certain protections against terrorism, then you will put in the next building those measures. Whereas if you have to put them in just by yourself, you may not find it worth it. The insurance industry actually can take a major lead on this.
Yeah, I agree. You're saying, what is the sprinkler system for terrorism? We put sprinkler systems against fire risk. There must be a corresponding security system which acts as a mitigation or protection against terrorism, and you should get a premium reduction for that or a premium increase if you haven't got it. And for big companies, there should be that kind of research at the point of pricing.
But it won't necessarily stop the event itself. Please.
Kishore Mahbubani, Dean, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Singapore. Let me suggest one perfect storm. Listening to all the problems, the only solutions are global solutions. The world has to come together to do this, and only one country can bring the world together to do this, the United States. It has to work through multilateral institutions. Right now, the United States is weakening multilateral institutions. But when the day comes, and the United States awakes that to deal with climate change, pandemics, failed states, you need international organizations, you need multilateral states. And when the United States goes back to them, they say, sorry, we don't believe you. We don't really think you really want to solve the world's problems. You just want to take care of yourself. How do you handle that kind of perfect storm?
Anyone want to respond? Gareth?
You're right. I mean, the US has got to realize that profoundly self-interest demands participation, support for multilateral institutions, for delivery purposes. It can't happen any other way.
Right.
This is the year to make it happen. We're not sufficiently emphasising how much is at stake here in 2005, how big an opportunity it is with all this summitry that's going on, all these reports that are feeding in, all this agenda setting. If we miss this opportunity, we're really going to be looking in very bad shape in the next decade.
Fred?
The same issue, of course, arises on the much more prosaic economic risks that I talked about earlier. The current problem of the international imbalances that I talked about is a setup for an internationally cooperative response. The U.S. has to act on fiscal policy. The surplus countries have to act on fiscal and monetary in the opposite direction. And there has to be a very cohesive approach to resolve the exchange rate imbalances in a way that will be gradual and orderly rather than disruptive and crisis-related. Additional countries, China and others in Asia, have to be brought into the picture. It is a textbook case in which international cooperation could pay enormous dividends. Yet there is virtually no initiative in that direction, in part because the United States has abdicated its traditional leadership, but I have to say, I don't see any great pushes in that direction from Europe or Asia either. In short, there is a gross failure of leadership to bring international cooperation to bear on manifestly global economic issues. How can it be that globalization has proceeded to the point it has, and the governance of globalization has virtually collapsed?
Sam?
I think, Fred, you've said it very well. The U.S. has to take leadership here, but the U.S. has to do that with leadership from the EU as well. Not just dialogue, but actual courses of action proposed, whether it's economic, geopolitical. You take the U.S., you take the EU, and you take China on any of these simple issues, complex issues, and you can come to answers. But I think that the issue has been over and over and over that one of the three is looked to take the lead, and the U.S. alone will not do it. We've seen that. But the U.S., even if they did it alone, unless the EU comes to actionable items and are willing to move on them, you're not going to solve these problems either.
Does anyone up here or anyone in the audience want to challenge the idea that there has been a gross failure of leadership on these 4 areas of risks? In other words, there is significant, solid, robust political leadership. I think that's my summary of this event. I have to bring it to a close. Does anyone up here have a vision of that dreadful perfect storm which they want to just contribute at this stage? Thank you all very much indeed.